Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode in the history of bad ideas is about history, or rather, it's about a way of doing history. I'm talking to the historian Alec Ryrie about narrative history and what can go wrong with that. Alec, maybe we should start by trying to say what narrative history is. And one way of doing that is to do the history of it, go back to the beginning. My understanding is that human beings have always tried to make sense of their world, our world, by telling stories about it. And probably traditionally, that is the default for trying to make sense of who we are. We tell myths, sagas, religious narratives, so on. What makes narrative history different from that? Or is narrative history in its origin actually just an extension of that?
I don't think you can draw any kind of sharp line between the two. They evolve, but narrative history of the kind I'm talking about, that I want to call out as a bad idea, is maybe distinct from that broader sense of telling the past in narrative form, in the same way that the novel as a form is distinct from the broader phenomenon of storytelling. You know, this is a particular way of doing narrative. And I mean, I should say, I probably need to start by saying I love narrative history. It's the mode of history writing which I think comes naturally to us, which helps to make the subject come alive. And it's precisely because it's so appealing, but also has dangers baked into it, that I think we need to pull those out. So I'm absolutely not trying to suggest stop telling stories historically. I mean, partly because that would be a terrible idea, and also because it's just not going to happen. It's the way that we think about time and about the past. I suppose my objection is not so much that we tell the stories, it's if we start believing them, or thinking that they actually are able to express in some authoritative way what's happened in the past.
So if we take the analogy with the novel, people argue about what the first novel was, whether it was Clarissa or something else, but I think it's thought to be an 18th century invention. Can you tell us when you think narrative history separates itself out from these other forms of traditional storytelling, myth-making and the rest? Is there an origin moment for this?
I think the origin moment, at least as we see it in the West, as I see it in the Western tradition, is the classical era in Greece. And a lot of this goes back to the two great Greek founding fathers of the Western historiographical tradition. So we're talking about Herodotus and Thucydides in the 5th century BC, who have always, and I think rightly, been paired and opposed to one another as two ways of doing history. And I mean, if you want a shorthand for what I'm suggesting today, it's that we need more Herodotus and less Thucydides. So Herodotus is a couple of generations older. So, you know, he's the first person to be writing in this mode. And I mean, there's a narrative thread running through his book, but it's very meandering. You know, he says that the overall question he's trying to answer is how it is that the East and the West, the Greeks and the Eastern peoples, the Persians in particular, came to fight, although that's a thread he takes back as far as the Trojan War, of this conflict between Europe and Asia. But the larger part of the book consists of digressions from this, as he is wandering off to talk at great length about places he's visited or peoples that he's heard about. It is as much geography and ethnography as it is history, as we would tell it. There is a wealth of anecdote and simple gossip, and he's also very eclectic about what he includes. So he will write down stories that he has been told regardless of whether or not he himself believes them, and is often, in his kind of chatty, disorganized way, pretty open about what his sources are. He lets you see his working. He does, when he gets into the thread of his actual narrative, which is, again, full of these ridiculous, glorious stories, like, the man at the Battle of Plataea, who supposedly carried an anchor onto the battlefield with him so that he could plant it so he couldn't be moved. And then when the enemy retreated, he up anchored and pursued them. This is nonsense, but it's wonderful nonsense. He does include some overall interpretation of what this means. But a lot of that for him is ultimately framed through the actions of the gods, who, compared to many Greek writers, he keeps the gods at arm's length, but they're there as an explanatory backstop. Then you have Thucydides coming along a couple of generations later at the other end of the century. And Thucydides is writing clearly in explicit reaction, kind of methodologically, to what he's read in Herodotus. He never mentions Herodotus by name, but there are a few times when he pauses and criticizes what he has done. And some scholars have said this, and it's obviously nonsense in that kind of mode. He is much more invisible within his own narrative. He floats above it as this authoritative voice. He's much more methodologically precise. He's developed a system for dating the events he's talking about, and it's much more focused on a single set of events, this great war between Athens and Sparta. He's very proud of his dating system, with some justification. He also quotes from original documents, not much, but a few times we have that kind of evidence. There's times when it can look like, if you squint, like modern academic historiography. But then he also tells you that there are a number of set-piece speeches scattered throughout his book, some of which have become very famous, like Pericles' funeral oration, or much quoted this year, the Melian dialogue, where the people of Athens supposedly have this amoral ethical debate with the people of Melos about whether or not they ought to exterminate them. And the line about the strong doing what they can and the weak suffering what they must is much quoted as if the Athenians really said it. I think there's no indication that such a debate ever took place, much less that such improbable things were said in it. And he tells us that these speeches are what people ought to have said, rather than necessarily what his sources have allowed him to reconstruct. It's also plain in this narrative that he has an axe to grind, that he is representing a particular defeated faction within Athenian politics, and the way he goes after some of the characters in his stories, like the great general Alcibiades, make it clear that they're sour grapes here. But the authoritative voice in which he presents this as the way of understanding the war means that it's easy to miss all of those tendentious qualities about what he does. And so we've reached the point nowadays where there's been a lot of talk in contemporary international relations about the so-called Thucydides trap, his argument that the war was inevitable because it was a point of collision between an established power in Athens and a rising power in Sparta, and that's been applied to American-Chinese relations, amongst others, in the modern world, or used as a way of explaining the origins of the First World War. And in some ways, I think that is a perfect encapsulation about what's so dangerous about the false pretensions to omniscience that this kind of history claims, to be able to spot the underlying patterns that are manifest in history and then start to make decisions about the inevitability of conflict based on them. Because, of course, nothing makes a conflict inevitable like believing that it's inevitable.
As you say, with Herodotus, you are not being given the impression that there is an authoritative version of events, because in a way, people who don't like Herodotus say it's like travel writing. These are some stories I heard on my travels. There is no one story here. There are many stories, and the charm of it is you get to see how different peoples tell their own stories of their accounts of the world that they live in. And so you end up with this sort of mélange of different ways of seeing the world. As you suggest, with Thucydides, you are given one author's account. And I get that the temptation that Thucydides maybe originates is that if you get the sequence right, if you get the chronology right, so first of all, it may not be possible to get the chronology right because there are always multiple chronologies. But if you get the chronology right, you are on the way to explaining why it happened, as though chronology and explanation somehow go together. Having said all of that, I've known people who adore Thucydides, and who think that a political education doesn't just begin with Thucydides, it more or less ends with Thucydides, not because of the Thucydides trap, not because of the way international relations writers in the 21st century overdetermine and overinterpret and are looking for their schemes and their explanations, but because Thucydides is the great historian of contingency. He's the great historian of irony and telling a story in which things never come out quite the way that the people at the heart of the story thought they would. So the omniscience is there, but it's omniscience seeing through the pretensions of his protagonists, and that it's a lesson in unintended consequences and inadvertence and the hubris of politics. Do you have any sympathy with that?
I do have sympathy with that, but I think that also helps to pinpoint what makes this approach so unnerving. That Thucydides absolutely recognizes these ironies, contingencies, and fallibilities in all of the peoples that he's talking about. It only helps to accentuate the claim to omniscience that he is making, the way that he's separating himself out from that sphere of contingency. And I mean, of course, for him, you can understand why he's writing at the end of the war, where he has seen how all this hubris has played out. You can appreciate why he has that view that all of this has come to nothing. But nevertheless, he is writing something which is the continuation of politics by other means. And I certainly don't think we should accept the implicit claim to omniscience, and nor do I think we should entirely depend on his honesty. And those two things perhaps go together.
It is sometimes, I think, believed that the key flaw in narrative history is that it overstates the significance of individuals, individual agency. It's often a form of biographical history, and we'll come on to that. And therefore it downplays, you can take your pick, structural forces, social conditions, the weather, or the gods. I mean, it could be the gods too.
Any kind of deus ex machina is difficult to incorporate if it doesn't have a narrative arc.
Exactly. And so even if, as with Thucydides, you portray your individuals as somewhat stumbling around in the dark, nevertheless, they're the ones who make the history happen. Before we get on to whether narrative history overdoes biography, it is also true that in our own lives, we tend to think of our lives as having a life story. I mean, we tend to narrate our own histories and our own past. It feels like it's part of almost the human condition to want to turn what would otherwise be a quite disturbing, maybe even absurd sequence, not even sequence of events into something that has a narrative arc. So the problems with narrative history, do some of them have their origins in the basics of human psychology? I think we all do it. I mean, therapy might be able to teach you how to do it better or not to do it at all or to be aware. But I think it is part of being human that we want our lives to have a narrative.
It may be. I think it's hard for us to know most of these questions about what's fundamental to human nature. We haven't got a control to test it against. What we do know is that in our cultural tradition, that sense of each human life as being a story, and a story that can be told coherently, is pretty deep-rooted. But I do think that falls back into the way that biography has been understood, which, has shifted quite a lot over the centuries. If you look at those ancient models of life writing, Plutarch, Suetonius, and so forth, they are using individual biographies for the purposes of moral education. Plutarch is explicitly telling his biographies in pairs, in order that the two lives should illuminate one another for the purposes of instructing the reader and providing them with a kind of moral education. You see something, comparable to that in the dominant form of life writing in the medieval West, in hagiography. The lives of saints are, they're quite samey, but they're structured around this moral framing. And the fact that we look at them and think they're samey, they've lost the individuality, we can't spot the particular distinct narrative of each person which makes them unique. That is a very modern way of looking at it. They're saying, no, these are saints. You would expect them to be the same. And that similarity is part of what makes these narratives worth telling. And where they have parts of the story that don't fit the moral lesson, that you should draw from it, then those are the parts that are going to be suppressed or amended in order to tell the correct story from it. But you do also have coming alongside that the beginnings of another way of thinking about the shape of a life where, the crucial figure here is Augustine. Augustine's Confessions, it's not an autobiography in the modern sense of the word. Apart from anything else, the genre of the whole thing, it's written in the form of a prayer. It's a very lengthy prayer, an account of his life addressed to God, who already knows it all, of course. So, from a generic point of view, it's a slippery text to work with. But he is doing that Thucydidean thing of looking back on the period of his life where, as he now sees it, God was at work in leading him to his ultimate point of conversion through these various stages and the winding route by which he got there. A route which he could not perceive at the time, but which now, in retrospect, he is able to make sense of. And that instinct that under God's providence, your life has a narrative shape and a meaning which you cannot perceive, but God ultimately does, but which you may be able to perceive in part in retrospect as you look at how the hand of providence has shaped your life. That's going to become one which gets picked up in the Renaissance and becomes, I think, really still the dominant one with which we work in secularized form. When you read Puritan autobiographies or even journals, the Puritans do go in for intensive self-observation. And they will be looking at the shape of their lives, confident that their life has a meaning, that there is a narrative arc to it, to which it can meaningfully be reduced, and that their role is to try to discern what that arc might be. They're working within a framework of a doctrine of predestination, which is one of the principal things that gives a life that shape. And they're desperate to try to discern what that shape might be. Given that it is preordained, the only thing that you can do with it is to try to read it, to see if you can reach that point of understanding. And although in its origin that's an intensely theological way of understanding what a life is, it transitions pretty seamlessly into secular self-understandings. If you've reached the point of understanding that each individual life has a meaning and a narrative shape to it, that's a conception which is detachable from God. And the person who detaches it most famously, it's not famous in his own time, but has come to represent for us the turning point here, is Samuel Pepys, whose profound fascination with himself, the man who really raises self-centeredness to an art form and is trying to discern the meaning and the shape of his own life and of who he is, the sort of man that he is, the sort of man that he is becoming. That really seems to me to set the framework for the way that many of us naturally think about our lives down to the present. I was reading recently Darwin's autobiography, which he writes for his children in his old age. And it's very Pepysian. There is this sense of genuinely interested self-observation. He's looking at himself as a scientist, trying to work out what kind of man am I? What are the things that make me who I am? And trying to, and believing that he can, in a provisional way, draw out a meaningful pattern from that. And you still see this in modern biographical writing, that it's what the modern biographer aims to do is to tell a coherent story. If you produce a life which is just one damn thing after another, then it's not going to work as a work of literature.
And do you think at the heart of that is the idea not just that there's a narrative arc, but there is a direction of travel that doesn't necessarily have to be teleological, but as I said, in relation to Thucydides and the importance of chronology, sequence really matters. Things that come later, even if they're not more important, because it might be that the childhood in this biography is the key to everything, but things that come later are clarifications or developments or consequences of the things that come earlier. And so you do automatically think if you can get them in the right order, you have explained something.
I think it's more than that. The nature of how the life ends, I mean, that is, if you're writing about somebody who's already died, is crucial for defining the meaning of the life as a whole. I mean, Herodotus tells a series of stories to exactly this effect, so maybe these things become more tangled than I want to admit.
And just to say, presumably you don't mean in the Roman sense that the Romans sometimes said, I'm not interested in the life. I want to know how he died in the sense, was he brave? What did he say? What happened as his house was burning down? The moment of death trumps everything that went before it. This isn't that. This is something else.
It's not quite that, although I think that can be a part of it. But how the life comes to an end. Is this ultimately a tragic story, or, does whoever it is go and live happily ever after and, die at a great age surrounded by children and grandchildren? That profoundly affects the way that we read the story. And when you do have, I mean, as of course we often do, biographies of people who are still alive, there remains a sense that this is still deeply uncertain because, well, a biography of Jimmy Savile written 10 years before he died would have come out rather differently from one written nowadays. It's only in retrospect that it's possible to see what the overall narrative shape of the life is. But in a sense, the closer you look, the more you become tangled in contingency, the harder it is to extract a meaningful narrative arc. And you end up with, what's his name, the fellow who wrote the 4-volume biography of LBJ.
Robert Caro.
Which is, I have not read all of it by any means, but enough to be daunted and amazed and a little put off by the sheer scale of that effort. It's a sort of Borgesian attempt to reproduce reality on a one-to-one scale.
And notoriously, once you get past the first volume, it's taken longer to write than it took to live, which is quite Borgesian in itself. It's like the map that's more detailed than the reality that it describes.
Exactly. The map of the country that's done on a one-to-one scale, which is, of course, the only way of coming close to telling any kind of definitive truth. But then it also reveals that the project of writing even a single biography is ultimately insane and impossible, because any one human being contains far more complexity than they themselves are able to express or to sum up, partly because they continue to live as they're trying to do so. For somebody else from outside to try to encompass that is it's a mad project or an impossible one. And then the problem is when we try to move from the impossible project of telling the meaningful story of one human life to trying to take this model of believing that there is a narrative arc that can be discerned, not simply a set of stories that could be told, but a true story that can be told. And we then try to roll that out to telling the stories of whole groups of people, societies, countries, nations.
The Caro example is interesting. Not only are the books full of great stories, I mean, he's a brilliant storyteller, and a lot of people describe those books as quite novelistic, but also part of their theme is that the agency of Lyndon Johnson was the difference, particularly the best of those volumes, the one about him as the majority leader in the Senate, where one man came and he unblocked an institution that had been blocked for the best part of a century through his force of will, through his force of personality, through his political genius. And of course, this is one of the other features of narrative history that is often criticized. It's not just that within a life we have a hierarchy of events and incidents and we give them a priority, but we have a hierarchy of individual human beings within a wider political or social narrative, and there are one or two individuals in narrative history who are the difference makers. And the key to narrative history is to find them, to identify them. Maybe not all American presidents, but in the case of LBJ, the argument goes, in the case of this man, he and his personality made the difference. Tolstoy is maybe the greatest novelist of all, is also sometimes held up as the example of the person who made the case against that. Is your case similar to the Tolstoy case against valorizing the Napoleons?
It is. I mean, Tolstoy overdoes it, but it's an unfashionable view, so I want to stick up for it. I think most people who read War and Peace are thinking, crikey, this book is long enough already. These lengthy historiographical screeds are bits that you can meaningfully skip over. And, I think probably as a novel, it would have worked better if he'd left it out. But that doesn't mean he's wrong. And the way that his attention focuses on the twin arenas of war and politics, I think, is meaningful as a way of understanding this problem. I mean, the prominence of political history and military history within traditional narratives. I mean, again, this obviously goes back to Herodotus and Thucydides and other ancient writers. Is very strong, very clear, and I don't think it's a mystery why that these are the sorts of stories that you can tell that have a biographical, a personal quality, in which you can tell the story of the Punic War as a story of Hannibal. You can tell the story of the invasion of Russia as the story about Napoleon. You can build it around these individuals in the same way, of course, that the stories of politics can very often be told as the stories of LBJs, of these masterful individuals, not all of them men, but most, who are able to use the force of their personality or their genius in order to give shape to an entire era, a world in which most of the people are, as they would say in modern video gaming parlance, NPCs. These are essentially pieces to be shuffled around on the board who have no agency of their own. And of course, to attempt to write a narrative of the Battle of Borodino in which you described the individual agency of every soldier taking part and understood it from the different mixed perspective and experience, the chaos that is perceived by each individual in that, and then the slightly different version of chaos, or sometimes radically different, perceived by the man who was next to him. It's narratively impossible even to begin to do that. And so we reduce it to a story in which it's possible for a Napoleon to direct a battle, and where Tolstoy can point out, but this is chaos, and a man simply sitting at the front of it claiming that he is in control and knows what's going on as this situation plays out in front of him, of which he has virtually no understanding and over which he has even less control. And of course, that's overdone, and we can see points in which that level of individual agency really does matter. I'm not suggesting that LBJ was not really exercising some of these sorts of control. But we are drawn towards those sorts of stories, the stories that allow us to look at periods of profound complexity and change and to say, well, where are the individuals in this through whom we can tell the story? Just before LBJ's presidency, something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, it's not the most important event in human history, but it came very close to being the most important event in human history. And you can meaningfully tell that as a story which turns around a dozen or so people who are making decisions which, had they gone different ways, would have had consequences for billions in the most dramatic and immediate way. So I'm not saying these sorts of stories aren't real, but we are drawn towards narrative moments like that. And not unlike in your last but one series of bad ideas, you concluded that possibly the worst idea of all was the idea of the decisive battle, which in some ways is, I'm adding this simply as a footnote to or an extension to that claim, because once you've believed that the individual, the genius of the individual, is capable of shaping and determining events of the lives of lesser mortals to that extent, then it becomes possible for people to continue to believe that they are that individual, the person who will come in. After all these different failed prime ministerships, I'm going to be the one who will be able to come in and be the circuit breaker and to reset events. And not just that person themselves can believe it, but the people around them. The wider culture is eager to hope that, yes, the right individual in the right place in this moment is what we need. And it's that kind of biographical intervention in the historical process is what's going to turn this situation around.
So I'm going to try and pin you down here and ask you, are you saying when you suggest that we are drawn to these kinds of stories, that we ought to try to be drawn to other kinds of stories? Or are you saying that we should try and get away from the story as the mode in which we try to explain the relationship between the past and the present and indeed the future? Or are you saying we have to do it through stories, but we should be much more alert to the way in which they are not that different from the myth making, from which they try to distinguish themselves in the spirit of evidence based or objectivity or verifiability or whatever it is? Are you saying, yes, we have to have stories, but with an asterisk? We should have different stories, or we shouldn't have stories at all?
Well, there's no point saying we shouldn't have stories at all because we're going to. And as I said at the start, I love narrative history as a genre.
Just to be clear, there are historians who've tried to do history without the storytelling element, but they tend to now be called, they're other kinds of ologists, I think, sociologists or political scientists or something else.
Yes, and in some ways I think they probably row as close to the lines I'm worried about as some traditional narrative historians do. In some ways, what concerns me about the ways in which this is done is not so much that we're telling stories. Stories are what we do as animals, they're inevitable. But it's our claim that we can find definitive meanings in them. So tell the stories by all means. The trouble is if you start believing them, or in particular, believing that those stories are sufficient, that they exhaust the meaning. We have seen, I haven't begun to track this, but it seems to me we've shifted in the ways that biographies are titled, that you more often see a life rather than the biography, which seems to me a tiny step in the right direction to recognize the impossibility of what you're attempting to do and at least the provisionality of it. I mean, to some extent, this is the famous line that Chu Enlai never said, that, even when you're looking at events from 200 years ago, it's too soon to say what they might mean because the story's not finished yet. And so you can't discern what the overall narrative arc is. If the whole of Western civilization does collapse in one of the various apocalypses that we have in our repertoire at the moment, then whoever might be writing the history of it in the future, if anybody survives to do so, will tell it in a different way from how we would now, because as with the shape of a life, you know what the ending would be, and that's bound to bleed back into it. But what also concerns me about this kind of politico-military narrativization is that it loses the way that historical change very often actually happens, which is that it doesn't fit a neat narrative arc, and that the kinds of change that a Tolstoyan figure is riding rather than that a Napoleonic figure is driving often really can't, as Augustine would recognize, be seen until after it's happened. I've been struck by this watching the Ukraine war unfold over the last 4 years, in which we have had a series of narratives that have been told about the way that that war is happening. From the initial moments of there is a story of inevitable Russian overwhelming victory, to then a story of plucky Ukrainian resistance, to then a story of counterattack and rolling back, points when it seems like the flow of events is moving in a different way. And then stories of stalemate, of slow grinding Russian advance, and we seem in the last few weeks and months to be swapping over to a different set of narratives. And in each case, we are trying to discern what is the story of this war, which is, of course, not really, as most of this is not about a way of understanding what's happened in the past, but a way of trying to predict the shape of the future, to extrapolate from where we are at the moment and to say, so actually now we had misunderstood what the story of this war was. Now it seems the story of this war is this. It's one of ultimately the overwhelming force of Russian numbers, or ultimately, the pluck and determination of Ukrainian drone operators, or whatever it might be. What is the narrative that makes sense of this? But that's not the way that warfare works. This is a story which has a few individuals in leading political and command roles on each side, But beyond that, it's a story of hundreds of thousands of combatants, millions of people involved in other roles. The fact that we struggle to reduce all of those irreducible lives, all of those irreducibly complex people, into a single neat narrative arc doesn't reflect that we haven't found the right narrative arc yet. It reflects the fact that the way history unfolds is not reducible to that kind of storytelling. And what applies there, even on the military level, when we apply it to the realm of economics, which is perhaps the most obvious realm in which you're trying to aggregate the individual actions of millions, billions of people and see what the collective outcome is. And yet still, we're trying to narrate our economic history in a way that reduces it to a comprehensible sense, which, as I say, it's inevitable that we're going to do that, as long as we don't kid ourselves into believing that what we have seen about it is true and that we're going to start to be able to predict the future from it. Because if you do that, then you start doing things like saying, well, it would be impossible for the American subprime market ever to tank because we've never seen something like that happening before. You start to spot simple patterns and forget that you are dealing with the actions of millions of irreducibly complex people who are not going to be modeled or have their lives narrativized in that kind of neat way.
With the Ukraine war, to connect it back to what you said earlier about how in this kind of history, the thing that happens at the end is the thing that then is taken to determine the meaning of what's gone before. At some point, that war will end, one way or the other, for better or for worse. And then there will thought to be a narrative arc, which historians will then try to interpret. And they may say for a while it's too soon to say. I don't know if this is true, it may be apocryphal. I read somewhere that the Chow En-lai thing, which is another example of how history is unreliable, he thought he was being asked about the events of 1968, and it was only a couple of years on. And so he said it's too soon to say. And his audience misunderstood him as answering a question about the French Revolution, about which, of course, he didn't think it was too soon to say. He's a Marxist. He thought they had plenty of time to. So again, I don't know. But with the Ukraine war, at a certain point, historians will then tell the story of the war. Is the problem that there'll be some consensus about the end? And when it ends, say it ends with the Ukrainian victory, the re-annexation of Crimea, say it did, the earlier versions would all be erased or they would be downplayed. And yet the earlier versions are themselves part of the story. So when we get to the final version and we get this is what it was, we now have discovered what it was, we end up throwing out the previous versions. But the previous versions, as they were going on, were as much a part of the story as the final version. And so in a way, it does go back to what you said earlier, that the problem with this arc is the way it prioritizes what comes at the end. And what comes at the end isn't the only thing that matters.
And in particular, I mean, we were talking about, Thucydides and contingency earlier, but contingency is precisely what can be lost in this kind of narrativizing, because that privileging of the end also privileges what did happen over what didn't. And, okay, fair enough, what did happen might have an obvious claim to our attention. But historical contingency is real. And we have a very strong temptation in a lot of modern thinking to overdetermine the inevitability of events that have happened, which in retrospect we can see have a strong element of chance in them, or that's disconnected from other kinds of events, or which appear to have rested on a coin toss. So, I mean, something like Donald Trump's first election, which comes down to a pretty fine margin, is there are a few people who are predicting that it's a reasonable, although minority chance. Most people at the time are assuming that it's very unlikely. Of course, he loses the popular vote by a substantial margin. I think the only sensible way to look at that and say is, that was a coin toss. It could have gone either way. Of course, the fact that a candidate like him could get to the point of it being so close is itself remarkable, and that really does tell us something. But the process of trying to understand that result in America and beyond, especially by the people who were shocked by it. Hillary Clinton herself writes a book about it called What Happened, in an attempt to try to deal with this unexpected event. It's very easy to think of this as revealing something profound about the United States, as overdetermined. And then especially when you see him winning again, after, of course, losing again, to say, actually, this revealed something deep about the inevitable course of American history. And if it hadn't been him, it would have been somebody else. Well, maybe. But the nature of contingency is that once you've swapped onto one track, there are events that follow from that. And that doesn't mean that there's a profound meaning driving them. I mean, the COVID pandemic, to take another recent, that is a classic chance event, in that it's perhaps inevitable that something of that sort would have happened at some point in the first half of this century. But the fact that it lands at the moment that it does, in the way that it does, the kind of virus that it is, with the particular mortality profile that it has, these are, unless you're going to be properly theological about it, these are chance events. And we really want to read them as revealing something to us about what our narrative is. What is the deep meaning of this? So the amount of effort that's put into deciding, was this a lab leak or was it something that happened in a wet market in Wuhan? I mean, it doesn't matter. We know that labs do sometimes leak and that zoonotic viruses do sometimes jump into the human population. It could have been either one. It doesn't affect the way that we guard against both of those dangers for the future, which we need to. But the way that we tell that story profoundly affects the way that we understand the meaning of this event. And so it helps to explain why different ones of us are so invested into trying to put one or other of those narrative framings onto it.
We're going to be doing an episode in this series about celebrity, and celebrity is something else which is overdetermined, in the sense that it's thought there must be an underlying explanation for why this random individual is now the most famous person in the world. The Donald Trump example is interesting because I know political scientists who think that they themselves were seduced by narratives, including narratives of celebrity and notoriety, and didn't notice that there was a very simple explanation for what happened in 2016, which is that Trump performed exactly as you would expect the Republican candidate to perform under those conditions. And it was remarkable that it was Donald Trump who filled the role of Republican candidate. But that slightly threw us off the scent, because it might have been that people weren't voting for Donald Trump. They were voting for the Republican candidate. It was a highly contingent event, but it was also a deeply structured event. Narrative history can't do either. Narrative history can't do the high coin toss contingency. It can't do the fact that actually after two terms of the other party, under there are those various tests under these economic conditions and so on, you can have a pretty good expectation of whether the incumbent party will win another term or not. But narrative history, and it seems potentially a particular vice of the age that we're in, with its relentless focus on personality, celebrity, and other things too. Narrative history falls between the two stools. It's not alert enough to the fact it was a toss of a coin. It's also not alert enough to the fact that you can swap the names around and you might get the same result.
I'm a little suspicious of those kinds of mathematical models of election outcomes because, again, you are reducing the complex behaviors of millions of people according to, and of course there are enough of these models that you can always find one that has spookily accurately predicted the outcome, like the octopus with the last World Cup. But yes, those kinds of deep explanations, and again, economics is very often the realm through which this is done, are really hard to spot in real time and are also really hard to make narrative sense of. Well, I suppose we've seen it in every great economic crisis in modern history, when one of the profound problems underlying it is that the people who find their livelihoods wrecked by whatever it is that is happening are not only suffering, but are desperately unsure why it's happening, and are trying to find an explanation, which they're going to want to, because they're human beings, to find it through some sort of narrative structure. And everybody knows that the best thing any narrative has is a villain. So, finding someone to blame, in the French Revolution, it was speculators. And, that sense of blaming famine or disaster on hoarders or on villainous operators of some kind goes right back as far as we can see. Now, that's a problem that I don't know how we solve because, as I say, we're going to want narrative explanations that at least in some way make comprehensible these enormous subterranean impersonal shifts that sweep people's lives away. But recognizing that the kind of narratives that we are inclined to tell are inadequate to the purpose might at least be a start.
I want to finish by asking you something which I'm aware, given that we've been talking about the pitfalls of being somewhat self-obsessed, might sound a little absurd, but I want to actually finish by asking you about podcasting, because I think it is very striking. The people listening to this, I think, will be alert to this because they've chosen to listen to what is basically a history podcast. I think on this podcast, we tell stories, but I don't think this is one of the narrative history ones. The narrative history ones are amazingly popular, and there are all sorts of different kinds of them, but it's one of the defining genres of the podcast world. One thing to be said for it is that it's, I think, to be preferred to TikTok history, say. Another thing that could be said about it is that the most popular of all of these podcasts, The Rest is History, is co-presented by someone who did translate Herodotus. When you look at this space, do you see the pitfalls of narrative history? Do you actually see there's such a range of different ways of doing it that actually we're better off than we were when people were just churning out their definitive biographies, that actually there's more variety in the storytelling? Podcasting, I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's, for now at least, possibly even the dominant mode of historical storytelling. Do you think it exemplifies the flaws, or do you think actually in this space we're seeing some of the remedies for it? Don't talk about this podcast. Talk about the rest. Talk about The Rest is History.
I won't talk about this podcast. But I do think as a medium, it has a potential lightness of touch, which helps us to get away from some of the worst errors of the kind that I've been talking about. So I'll compare two different podcasts. So, The Rest is History is very Herodotean in its approach. It has that sense of telling stories with a kind of eager liveliness and an eye for anecdote, sitting lightly to the interpretative authority that it's wielding. The very fact, and I suppose this really is inherent to the podcast medium, that podcasting is typically done through the means of a conversation. Not always, but that seems to be the most natural mode, which already gives it a degree of plurality, or at least the potential for plurality, a little bit of disagreement and dialogue baked into it, even if it's one person explaining and the other one questioning.
And also there's a bit of gossip built into it. I mean, you can hear the gossipy tone.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's something, which Tom Holland and John Sandbrook have cultivated, really effectively and built up that kind of Herodotean quality to it. So if you're going to do narrative history, that way of doing it, which, tells the story while also keeping it at arm's length. I don't think you could listen to, even some of their really, lengthy narrative series and think that what I'm hearing is the definitive authoritative story. It is a way of telling this story, and it sits lightly to it in that sense. Plus, they're also very good at moving up and down the scale from the, in the series in the First World War, for example, shifting from the accounts of individual soldiers, that one person at the Battle of Borodino, up to the perspective of the commanders. At the other end, you've got In Our Time, which obviously began still as a radio program, but has flourished perhaps even more as a podcast, not exclusively historical, but, that's one of the main modes in which it operates, where you have, something not unlike an undergraduate seminar, bringing together three different scholars of a subject who are led through something that may have a roughly chronological frame if they're working through an event about which the audience may not be familiar, and so they need to have the story told, but very little of that discussion is usually storytelling, and if you tune out for a minute, you can miss a critical part of it. So I mean, that is a way of doing much less narrative, much more analytical history of the kind that is able to pay attention to those sorts of deep structural affairs in a way that can really work and communicate itself to a mass audience. And I think one of the things that took everybody by surprise about that program when it first began and has made it continue to prosper is its ability to provide what might at first blush seem like quite off-puttingly academic analysis in the medium of a conversation between three specialists and a chair, a generalist who's able to hold it all together and to make it work. So I think either of those extremes work very nicely. You know, the light touch Herodoteans of The Rest is History, or the enlivened public-facing academic historians of In Our Time. It's the Thucydideans in between that you've got to watch.
And in case it seems like we're bigging up podcasts, my God, there have been a lot of podcasts recently about the Thucydidean trap. I mean,
Yes.
and their conversations too, and they're gossipy and all the rest of it, but they are not Herodotean.
No. Anyone who's talking about Thucydides, start counting your spoons.
For each of these series of bad ideas, I get to pick one bad idea of my own. And the episode with that in it will be coming out as a bonus on PPF Plus tomorrow. I'm exploring one of the things that most irritates me, the ubiquity, the unavoidability, the everywhereness of the news. I'm talking about why the news is a bad idea. Here's a clip. This saturation does not produce what Tocqueville hoped it would produce, a kind of lowering of the temperature. If anything, it raises the temperature. And then the problem that persists is the one that Thoreau identified, which is, for too many of the things that really matter, the question, what's new, or to put it more directly, what's the news? Tell me the news. Have you heard the news? These are the wrong questions to ask. The important thing is not necessarily the new thing. The new thing is often trivial. It's often gossip. It's often heightened emotion and anger. And it is, frankly, often advertising. And for some of the biggest questions, the biggest challenges that we face, newness is the wrong thing to look for. But we are addicted to it. I am addicted to it. We want to know what people are saying about this thing now. And it is necessary to take a step back sometimes to realize how absurd it is. It's easy to get sucked in. I always think one good way of trying to at least partially inoculate oneself against the absurdity of trying to decide what's important in a saturated news culture is to look at the way economic news is reported. If you'd like to get that bonus episode and all of the bonus episodes on PPF Plus, ad-free listening, 2 new bonus episodes every month, plus automatic sign-up to our newsletter, subscribe now. Just go to the link in our episode description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. It costs £5 a month, £50 for the year. We have not put the prices up for more than 2 years and would love to have you join. Next time in our regular slot, another bad idea, and this one with a much, much more recent history. It's barely 5 years old, but it may have gone wrong already. I'm talking to the political historian David Klemperer about what's gone wrong with the idea of Deliverism. That's next time in our regular slot. This has been Past, Present, Future.